On March 9, 1976, the deadliest cable car disaster in history occurred in the Italian Dolomite Alps. A cabin full of tourists fell from a height of 220 feet and crashed to the ground, killing 42 people. Of the 43 passengers, only one survived. 14-year-old Italian schoolgirl, Alessandra Piovezzana. At around 5 p.m. that day, one of the cable car operators, who was in his cabin, noticed something alarming: sparks between the cables near the first pylon. He immediately realized that something was wrong. The operator tried to contact the control room by phone, but found that the phone was not working. In just a few minutes, a tragedy would occur that could not be prevented. It was a normal March day in Cavalese. Tourists and locals were skiing, and children from a school group were enjoying an excursion. Nothing foreshadowed that a simple cable car ride would turn into a nightmare. How did a normal transportation system that carried thousands of people every year suddenly turn into a deadly trap? Why did the automatic safety system designed to prevent such disasters fail to save people? To understand how this disaster happened, we need to go back to the Dolomite Alps of the 1970s and trace the chain of events that led to the worst accident in the history of cable cars. Cavalese is a picturesque ski resort located at an altitude of about 3,280 feet in the Fiemme Valley in the Dolomites, in the province of Trentino in northern Italy. The town, with a population of about 5,000, is surrounded by majestic mountain peaks that attract tourists in both winter and summer. In the 1970s, Italy experienced a real boom in ski tourism. Thousands of winter sports enthusiasts from Germany, Austria, France, and other European countries came to the Italian Alps, attracted by the magnificent slopes, high-quality infrastructure, and relatively affordable prices. At that time, the economy of Cavalese and the entire Trentino region was heavily dependent on tourism. According to estimates at the time, up to 30 to 40% of the region's entire economy was accounted for by the tourism sector. The ski slopes on Mount Cermis, locally known as Alpe Cermis, were the jewel in the resort's crown, and access to them was provided by a system of cable cars, which later became the site of the tragedy. The cable car on Mount Cermis was built by the Italian company Falck Acciaierie e Ferriere Lombard in 1968 and had been in operation for only 8 years at the time of the disaster. It was a typical aerial tramway system of that time, about 2.5 to 3 miles long. It connected the lower station in Cavalese, 3,280 feet above sea level, with the summit of Alpe Cermis, about 6,560 feet, where the ski slopes were located. Between them was the Dos de Laresi intermediate station, which was used both for passenger transfers and for technical purposes. The technical configuration of the cable car consisted of 2 cabins moving in opposite directions. Each cabin was rectangular in shape, with panoramic windows providing tourists with a beautiful view of the surrounding mountains. The design was standard: a metal frame with a lightweight aluminum body attached to a massive 3-ton trolley that provided movement along the cables. The system used 2 types of cables: a load-bearing cable on which the cabin hung, and a traction cable that moved it. The cable car was designed to carry up to 40 people in a single cabin, making it a high-performance system capable of serving hundreds of tourists daily during peak season. The winter season in the Dolomites lasted from December to April, and it was during this time that the cable car operated at maximum capacity. From its opening in 1968 until March 1976, the system operated without any serious incidents. However, as will become clear later, this prosperity was deceptive. Behind the scenes, signs of trouble were emerging. The cables crossed repeatedly, triggering the safety system, but the operators considered this a routine situation that did not require special attention. March 9, 1976 was a typical day in the ski season in Cavalese. The sky was clear, with a moderate wind of about 12 to 18 miles per hour, and the temperature hovered around 0, typical March weather in the Dolomites. Tourists from various countries enjoyed skiing. and the cable car operated as usual. At 5:19 p.m., a cabin carrying 43 passengers down to Cavalese suddenly stopped. The automatic safety system had been triggered when it detected that the carrying and traction cables had crossed at the first pylon. Carlos Schweitzer, a seasonal worker with only a few weeks of experience and without the necessary license, was in the control room. The company Società Funivia Cavalese hired such unqualified operators to save money. Not knowing what to do, Schweitzer called a colleague. He assured him that such stops were common due to the excessive sensitivity of the automatic system and advised him to disable the safety system and restart the cable car. Schweitzer took out a special key and, without receiving official confirmation, disabled the safety system himself. At 5:20 p.m., the cable car started moving again, despite the continuing anomaly, the crossing of the cables. At the same time, operator Giorgio DiMatteo was the only passenger in the second cabin moving upward. He noticed sparks and heard a grinding noise at the point where the cables crossed. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, DiMatteo tried to use the cabin phone to alert the control room, but found that the phone was not working. A few seconds later, the cables, constantly rubbing against each other, began to break. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that the cable car was set to run at an increased speed of 5.5 minutes for the entire route, instead of the manufacturer's recommended 6.5 minutes. This modification, introduced to increase capacity, caused the cables to vibrate more strongly. Cable crossing on the Shermis cable car was not uncommon, but on March 9, 1976, the situation developed catastrophically. After Carlos Schweitzer disabled the safety system, the cables continued to rub against each other, creating critical tension in the metal. The main problems that led to the disaster had been developing for years. Società Funivia Cavalese systematically violated safety regulations in order to save money and increase profits. The investigation would later reveal a series of miscalculations that created the conditions for the tragedy. A key technical factor was the increased speed of the system. The cable car was originally designed to complete the route in 6.5 minutes, but the company's management reduced the time to 5.5 minutes. This decision, made to increase capacity, led to increased cable vibrations. At higher speeds, the suspension and traction cables swayed more, especially in windy conditions, which increased the risk of them crossing. The second critical factor was a routine disabling of the safety system. The automatic system regularly stopped the cable car when it detected that the cables had crossed, but instead of fixing the problem, the operator simply disabled the system. This became so common that the key to disable the system was worn out from constant use. The third factor was cost-cutting on personnel. The company hired unqualified seasonal workers instead of licensed operators. Carlos Schweitzer, who had only been working for a few weeks, did not have the knowledge to make the right decisions in a critical situation. Later, during the investigation, he failed the test to obtain an operator's license. This whole complex of problems remained invisible to passengers. Among the 43 people in the cabin were tourists of all ages, families with children, school children from Trento on an excursion, and German skiers from Munich. None of them suspected the impending danger. For about 40 to 50 seconds after the system restarted, the cables continued to rub against each other, creating sparks that were noticed by Giorgio DiMatteo from another cabin. The friction quickly destroyed the metal fibers of the suspension cable, which, although 2 inches thick and capable of withstanding enormous loads, gradually weakened. Meanwhile, in the cabin with 43 passengers, including 14-year-old Alessandra Piovesana and her friends, the ride was becoming alarming. After the sudden stop and restart, some passengers noticed unusual swaying. Some even began to laugh, perceiving the swaying as entertainment, unaware of the deadly danger. In Cavalese, tourists waited for the cabin to arrive, unaware that they would soon witness a tragedy. Employees at the lower station also continued to work as usual. In the control room, Carlos Schweitzer was not yet aware of the consequences of his decision. For him, it was a standard situation. The system often stopped, and operators were accustomed to resuming operation without giving it much thought. This systematic disregard for safety created conditions in which tragedy was virtually inevitable. At 5:21 p.m., less than a minute after Carlo Schweitzer restarted the system, what Giorgio Di Matteo had feared happened as he watched the sparks between the cables. The load-bearing cable, constantly rubbing against the traction cable, gave way. With a deafening sound that could be heard even in the center of Cavalese, the 2-inch steel cable snapped at the first pylon. At that moment, the cabin with 43 passengers was about 220 feet above the ground. Having lost its support, it began to fall rapidly. For the passengers, time seemed to stretch out. According to Alessandra Piovesana, the only survivor, the fall lasted only 4 seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. I clung to my friend Francesca. I couldn't breathe. It was as if I was lifted up and then pulled down again by my feet. Through the window, I could see the ground approaching. 4 seconds is a moment, but also an eternity. I thought I was going to die, she recalled later. The impact with the ground was devastating. The light cabin was crushed under the weight of the 3-ton trolley to which it was attached. The aluminum structures and panoramic windows were blown to pieces. But the nightmare did not end there. For several more seconds, the system continued to operate, dragging the wrecked cabin with people inside along the ground for 300 to 600 feet until Schweitzer stopped it. Panic broke out among the passengers. Those who remained conscious screamed in pain and fear. Alessandra Piovesana remembered hearing voices that soon fell silent forever. She lost consciousness, but regained it before the rescuers arrived. When she woke up, she tried to talk to her friend Francesca, but she did not respond. Her friend Giovanni was crying nearby, cowering in a ball. The sound of the crash and the screams that followed attracted the attention of workers at the lower station, who immediately called for help. The first rescuers, local police, Carabinieri, and the Trentino Fire Department arrived at the scene about 15 to 20 minutes after the accident, around 5:35 to 5:40 p.m. They were joined by volunteers from Cavalese. A horrific scene of destruction unfolded before the rescuers. The cabin was mangled. Bodies were scattered everywhere, along with skis and personal belongings. Of the 43 people in the cabin, 42 died instantly, or within minutes of the crash. The only survivor was Alessandra Piovesana, who was protected from fatal injuries by the bodies of other passengers surrounding her at the moment of the crash. Medics quickly evacuated the girl to a hospital in Trento. She had serious injuries that required immediate surgery, but her life was not in danger. Among the dead were 15 children aged 7 to 15, many of whom were part of the school group to which Alessandra belonged. The nationality of the victims reflected the international character of the resort: 21 German citizens, 11 Italians, 7 Austrians, and 1 French woman. Among the Italian victims was a family from Trento, parents with 2 children aged 7 and 10. 2 crew members also died, including local resident Fabio Rusti. News of the disaster spread quickly throughout Cavalese, and then throughout Italy. A peaceful day of skiing turned into the greatest tragedy in the history of cable cars. The rescue operation continued until late at night on March 9th, 1976. By the morning of March 10th, all the bodies of the victims had been taken to a temporary morgue set up by the Trentino authorities. The difficult process of identification began. Many of the victims had suffered serious injuries in the fall, which made the process even more difficult for their grief-stricken relatives. News of the disaster spread around the world in an instant. The New York Times put the story on its front page, calling it the worst cable car disaster in history. The European media reacted even more emotionally, especially in Germany and Austria, whose citizens made up the majority of the victims. The death of 15 children had a particularly strong impact, making the tragedy even more heartbreaking. Mourning was declared in Cavalese. The local priest held a memorial service attended by hundreds of people. Hotels in the town were filled with relatives of the victims arriving from Germany, Austria, and other parts of Italy. The municipality and tourist companies helped with accommodation for the families and organized the transport of the bodies to their homeland. The investigation into the disaster began immediately. Technical experts from the Italian Ministry of Transport methodically examined the wreckage, cables, and equipment. An alarming pattern of violations soon emerged. Excessive speed, 5.5 minutes instead of the recommended 6.5. The use of unlicensed operators, and, most shocking to investigators, the regular disabling of the safety system. When Carlo Schweitzer was asked to take the operator's license test, he failed to complete the tasks, clearly demonstrating his unpreparedness for such a responsible job. The economic and reputational blow to Cavalese was significant. Tourist numbers plummeted, especially from Germany and Austria. Hotels and restaurants were empty, and the local economy, which depended on tourism for a third of its income, plunged into crisis. The resort, previously known for its picturesque slopes and hospitality, was now associated with tragedy. In the fall of 1976, the trial began. Carlo Schweitzer and 3 other cable car employees, including a middle manager responsible for hiring and training staff, were in the dock. The charges included manslaughter, negligence, and safety violations. The sentences handed down in 1977 were met with mixed reactions. Schweitzer was sentenced to 3 years in prison but was released after 9 months. The other defendants received similar sentences. Many in the region, especially in Trentino, considered Schweitzer a scapegoat. They believed that the management of Società Funivi Cavalese should have been held more accountable for systematic safety violations and cutbacks in staff training. Public meetings were held in Trento to discuss necessary reforms in cable car management. The victims' families demanded compensation and tighter safety controls. Their persistence, reinforced by international attention, prompted the Italian authorities to review legislation in this area. The sole survivor, 14-year-old Alessandra Piovezzana, found herself in the spotlight. A long road to recovery lay ahead of her. Numerous operations and rehabilitation stretched over 5 years. But despite the physical and psychological trials, she was able to return to normal life and later chose a career as a journalist, becoming a living symbol of the human spirit in the face of tragedy. When the shock of the tragedy had subsided somewhat, Cavalese was faced with a painful question: what to do next? The picturesque town, which existed thanks to tourists, could not afford to be left without its main transport link to the ski slopes. In the fall of 1976, after the investigation was completed, it was decided to rebuild the cable car. The new system was ready for the 1976 to 1977 winter season. Its opening was closely watched by the press and the public. Many wondered, could this road be trusted again? To dispel doubts, the company held public demonstrations of the improved safety system, which now required double authorization to shut down. "We have learned from the past," company representatives assured the public. But the return of tourists was a slow process. It took years to restore confidence. In 1977, a modest memorial was erected at the site of the cabin's fall, a granite slab with the names of the 43 victims. A small garden was laid out around it, where flowers bloom every spring. Nearby stands a simple cross, a tribute to the Christian traditions of the region. This quiet corner, surrounded by majestic mountains, has become a place of pilgrimage for the families of the victims and a symbol of the fragility of human life. Alessandra Piovezzana, who miraculously survived the disaster, became a living symbol of that day. After 5 years of operations and rehabilitation, she returned to a full life. Choosing a career as a journalist, Alessandra sometimes wrote about her experience of survival and the process of recovery. "This tragedy defined my life, but I refuse to let it define my future," she said in an interview on the 20th anniversary of the disaster. Until her death from illness in 2009, she regularly attended memorial services in Cavalere, embodying the strength of the human spirit in the face of adversity. The impact of the disaster reached far beyond the small alpine town. the tragedy in Cavalese became a turning point for cable car safety around the world. Italy introduced strict laws requiring mandatory licensing of operators and regular technical inspections. Switzerland and Austria followed suit, revising their safety standards. Years after the tragedy, Cavalese suffered another blow. In 1998, an American military aircraft flying at an unacceptably low altitude severed a cable car cable, killing 20 people. This second disaster, although it occurred for completely different reasons, seemed to confirm that Cavalese was marked by tragedy. Today, if you visit Cavalese, you will see a modern cable car that bears little resemblance to the 1976 system. Small gondolas instead of large cabins. The latest safety technology and constant monitoring have all been introduced in response to the lessons of the past. Tourists are once again climbing the slopes of Cavalese, enjoying the breathtaking views of the Dolomites. Memories of the tragedy are gradually fading. The younger generation of Cavalese residents often knows more about the 1998 disaster because of its international resonance. But every year in March, people gather at the local church to honor the memory of those who died. They lay flowers at the memorial, light candles, and quietly recite the names of those who did not return from the mountain on that fateful day of March 9th, 1976. The cable car disaster in Cavalese on March 9, 1976, which claimed 42 lives, remains the deadliest in the history of such transport systems. But behind the dry figures lies a profound human tragedy, and a lesson that the world learned at too high a price. The history of Cavalese is striking for the contrast between the incredible beauty of the place and the tragedy that left an indelible mark on it. In the same mountains that attract tourists with breathtaking views and magnificent slopes, the memory of the day when a routine safety violation turned into an irreparable loss is preserved. This disaster was not the result of an unexpected natural disaster or an inevitable technical malfunction. It was the result of a series of careless decisions, cutting corners on staff training, disabling safety systems, and increasing speed for profit. Individually, each of these decisions may have seemed like a minor compromise, but together they created the conditions for tragedy. Today, visitors to Cavalese pause for a moment as they pass by the modest memorial bearing the names of those who died. This quiet pause is a tribute not only to the victims, but also a reminder that behind every technical regulation and every safety system, there are human lives. And no commercial interest is worth disregarding this simple truth. Have you ever encountered a situation where safety rules seem too strict or excessive? Perhaps the story of Cavalese will make us all look differently at these inconvenient restrictions. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think we have learned lessons from tragedies like this? Or is the pursuit of profit and convenience still prioritized over safety? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like it. It's the best thing you can do for us. Also, subscribe to the channel for more incredible and sometimes shocking stories. Take care, and see you in the next episode.